Okay, I think we are live now. Can you hear me,
Okay.
Justin?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so if you are joining us on LinkedIn or YouTube or Twitch, please do well to drop a message on our Discord community. So please, if you are currently on this call, so I can see a couple of people here. Our instructor is already here, Justin. Please do well to drop a message on the cloud computing room on Discord. So we'll have more people joining us from LinkedIn, joining us from YouTube, and joining us from Twitch. So please do well to drop a message so we can have more people here in this class. All right, so welcome, Justin. Justin Garrison. Is it Garrison or Garrison?
Garrison, I think my video just froze.
All right, okay. Okay, so welcome once again, Justin. Thank you so much for being here. All right, I'll just do a short introduction. So Justin Garrison is based in it's in California, yes,
Yeah.
and is a cloud engineer on AWS, and is going to be taking us today on in today's class. So please, 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 if you have your friends are not here or your colleague, please do well to drop a message on the Discord chat room so we'll have more persons joining us because we are starting now. So please do well to drop a message on Discord so we'll have more people joining from Twitch, from YouTube, and on LinkedIn. So yeah, thank you once again, Justin, for being here. Yeah, and you can start. You can start. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for the invite and thanks for the intro. I'm an engineer at AWS. I've been at Amazon for about 3.5 years, and I've been using Amazon for a lot longer as a customer. And so I'm really happy to, you know, join this and give a pretty gentle introduction to what AWS is and kind of how you use it. And so I have a few things that I want to talk about, but really I want to understand these concepts together with you because I have been using AWS for so long. I don't remember what it's like to be new, and even what it's like to be new when I started Amazon, using Amazon versus what it's like to be new today are completely different things. So if you can give me questions as we go through this. I would love to have that interaction to be able to know what it's like for you to learn Amazon today and the services, because again, I can't know what it's like and I want to understand it better from what your background is, what you're going through, what you've learned in the past, and how you want to use it. And that'll help me a lot, not only in this call, be able to maybe answer some questions, but also better understand just what the community is facing today as you're trying to learn these services. So I don't do a lot of slides typically. I don't prepare slides. I'm not good at making slides, but I have a couple slides just as a brief overview because it's easier to show words than to talk about them. So yeah, thank you for the. Um, so cloud computing and Amazon. I know there's been multiple videos already about cloud computing and what it is, how it works, kind of things. Um, the three like fundamentals of cloud computing, as I like to describe them, are there's infrastructure and there's platforms and there's software, and all of those things are parts of cloud computing. They're all ways to use cloud computing environments, but they have different focuses depending on your background and what you're trying to do and what you're familiar with. And the first one is this infrastructure as a service, and I like to equate it to this thing. If you know what this is a modem, which old network modem. If you know what this is, if you like computers, if you like the hardware, infrastructure as a service is actually going to be a great entry for you because that lets you piece together things like you normally would plug in a computer. If you've built computers or those sorts of things, that's a great way to just like, I know how to fundamentally build stuff with computers and with machines. If you've ever worked in a data center, if you've worked with servers, if you understand how computers all fit together in a room and they need cooling and power and storage and all this other stuff, like that is this infrastructure piece that we used to do physically. And I realized now that I used to do it physically in multiple jobs, but people don't do that as much anymore. It's not really common for your first entry into technology or into things to be, I went and plugged in servers and then powered them on and then used them. And getting logging into a remote server in a data center was very different experience for me starting out versus what people do today. And so infrastructure, if you know those infrastructure pieces, this is probably a great place for you to start because it's very flexible and you can do a lot of things with it. The platform as a service is you want some of those things like how servers get plugged in and how networking works. You want those just to go away. You don't really care about those things. I kind of equate that to a spreadsheet where you get to do a lot of work in a spreadsheet. If you've ever used Google Sheets or Microsoft Excel, the most widely used database in the world. And you can do a lot with a spreadsheet, but you don't have to worry about what computer is it running on necessarily, right? If you log into Google Sheets, you're just using that. You're using Sheets and you're trying to solve your problem with some sort of data of I need to figure out what the trend is for this. I need to build a graph, something like that. Platform as a service gives you some components to go build something on top of it. You bring your own data, you have your own goals for what you're going to accomplish with that platform or with that tool, and you can just take that and run with it. And that's like one level above usually where like the hardware is. And sometimes hardware things look similar to platforms, like there's some overlap. But in many cases, this is like, I need a tool to go do more work or build something with it. The software as a service is you're not necessarily building with this tool, you're using the tool. You're going through and you're saying, hey, I need a tool that does this so I can do something else. I don't want to focus on that anymore. I used to run email servers, right? And I ran plenty of email servers, and there was a lot of things you have to do to run, not only plug in the server and get it started, you had to install email routing applications and configure them, and mailboxes for users, and you had to set up users and quote all this stuff you used to have to do. And Gmail, it just kind of works. It's just like, I just need to use email. I don't want to build email. I don't want to plug in the hardware. I just want one layer above that where it's just like, just let me email someone. And that's really where the software as a service, which is still much a part of cloud computing, because someone else can run that for you and you can use it. In some cases, if it's a good service or it's something that is valuable to you, you might pay for it. But in a lot of cases, these layers are kind of what you're familiar with and what your background is. And that's generally how I like to break down what cloud computing is. It's one of those three categories, and Amazon and AWS has services that fit all of those categories. And so this isn't like a special thing that you have to go somewhere else for one piece or another. Like there are components of AWS that fit all of these use cases, and that's where I kind of wanted to explain some of that. I started playing around with AWS around 2009 ish. And these were the services that were available. this was it. There was 5 of them, and it kind of gave you some core functionality to be able to run something that looked like the servers that I was plugging into a data center at the time. It looked like that's where I could run an EC2 instance and an EBS volume, like give me a hard drive. And that was all I really needed. And there was this database thing if I wanted to use a database, and there was some other, services, but I didn't really need those at the time. I just wanted a VM, a server that ran somewhere else. And that's what it looked like for me to learn, which was a great entry because I didn't have a lot of options. I could go and I could just click through the console and say, okay, I understand. I got a console. I got a VM somewhere. I understood how that worked because I was familiar with that. AWS has grown a lot since 2006. And a lot of people that I know started playing with it and looking at it more around this time frame, around like the 2014-ish. And AWS was already growing really, really fast with all of these options and helping people understand, like, or trying to help people understand what was possible. There's so many tools and services. How do they fit those together to make what they wanted to build with it? And as more and more people started using AWS, that right around turned and said, oh, actually, we need a service that does this for this customer. Today, it's even harder to get started. And this is where I don't think that, like, this still is a lot of services for me, and I work here. Not all of these, none of these services is for everyone. Like, you should not use all of these services. No one's out there using all of these services. So a big thing that a lot of people see this and they're like, I could never learn that. And that's fine. Nobody's learning all of it, guarantee you. But all of these are made for someone. There is a customer, there is a person that needs at least, some of these services, and all of them were made with intention to have someone use them. But when you look at that, try not to get overwhelmed by, there's too many, what would I ever do? I don't know where to start. And you have to understand just which pieces you're interested in solving, what problem it is that you're trying to solve, so that you can focus on just those areas. Don't just say like, I have to learn it all, because that you would be, if I was starting today and trying to learn, I would be paralyzed. And again, if you can help me understand what you're trying to do with AWS, what you're trying to learn, what you're trying to accomplish in AWS, that's maybe you're doing today with servers or just desktops or something else, that would be a big help for me, even in this talk, so I can show you just what it is that we can do. I just saw this picture last week and I was like, this is amazing. I was like, I want to use that for the talk. All of those pieces are building blocks. They allow you to piece them together. Many of them are infrastructure components that lets you build with it. But some of them are the higher level paths and software pieces that allow you to use them in various degrees. But when I like to think about it, this is essentially, you want to build something. And if you've ever had a Lego kit, it comes in bags. All of the pieces, it's not like one box full of, what is this one? 4,000 pieces. It's like, if you just dumped out 4,000 pieces, that would be overwhelming to start. You wouldn't be able to start building anything because there's too many things, there's too many parts. And how Lego does it is they break it up into bags. And this kit probably has 7 or 8 bags, and those are different steps. And they say, hey, first we're going to build the base. Here's the pieces you need for the base. Don't focus on anything else. You're not going to look at all the other parts, all the other bags yet. We're just looking at what the base needs, and then focusing on building that piece. And that's how you build up anything inside of a cloud provider. And I used to work at Disney. I worked on Disney Plus. I worked on some of our movies, and this is how it started there too, where you start at the bottom. We just got to focus on one piece of the puzzle of this, what we're building, and then we can keep going from there, one step at a time. But you can also build something else. Like, that's the flexibility of these building blocks. You could build a castle, you could build a spaceship, you could build whatever you want. And that's why these tools, why AWS is so powerful for users, for customers, because we don't necessarily prescribe how it goes together, but a lot of these blocks in this Millennium Falcon, this one has 7,500 pieces. A lot of them are the same. They're still gray blocks. They're just the same thing put together in different ways. And all of those AWS services can be combined in an infinite number of ways. And so you don't have to look at it as, I need to build one thing, or this is my project that I need to accomplish for just this one thing. Figure out how the pieces can fit together and how they interact. And that'll help you understand what's possible by not needing to go out and buy routers and then plug them in. And you can still do that. Like, there's still plenty of interaction, but being able to piece things together with a low effort, with saving a lot of time. Like, all the data centers that I've built in the past and worked on in the past, it would take months to go get a computer somewhere. I had to go like, let me go research what's available. Let me research what I need. Let me go figure out what the budget is. Let me go talk to someone to buy it. Few months later, it shows up in the mail. Then I got to unbox it. All those things take a lot of time, and it's really, really slow to experiment, to try something, to figure out, what can I do? What is possible? And by the time it was 3 months later, I'm like, why did I order this? Why am I interested? Those things are really hard to do in a physical world, and being able to experiment and try new things with all of these components and say, hey, have you ever sat down in front of a bunch of Lego bricks and just wanted to build whatever came to mind? You can do that. And in AWS, you can too. And that's all my actual slides. I did want to show one other thing. Let me stop this. I saw a question here about, what do I advise a cloud engineer or a DevOps to know in AWS? And that's a great question. And I don't know where my mouse went. Oh, it's down here. That's why. I generally would advise you learn the things that align with whatever. If you have a job now, I'm assuming you're a cloud engineer or DevOps engineer at a company, and it'd be great to find out what they're using and being able to dive deep in those areas, because you can't dive deep in all of them. If you know how all of those tools work, you don't know how any of them fit together, because you haven't gone deep into any one area to figure out how it ties to something else. So figuring out what it is that your company's building or what you're trying to build in a project, those are the areas to focus on first. There are a lot of fundamentals in AWS. EC2 is a good one. Like getting a VM anywhere in the world, that's a good thing to know, but your company may split up who manages each piece. Another group might manage permissions. One group might manage network. One group might manage compute. So do you need to know all three of those things? Maybe, maybe not. It's maybe not for your role. But focusing on some of the ones that your business is trying to use or integrate with, I think is a great start. If you don't know, I would try to find some of the fundamentals of what it looks like to build a private cloud in AWS. And I'm going to go over that in just a little bit, because that's basically like building data centers. And all the concepts are similar to building a data center, a physical data center. And if I'm realizing, like people don't know how to do that anymore. And so, but real quick, I did want to say AWS services have roughly 3 different types. And they're broken up into a service that is in a data center and is kind of confined to a data center. That's called an availability zone. And I think of that as just like a container. All of my services and resources for that availability zone are going in here, and they don't go beyond this border. But when I was building data centers physically, like we had one data center and then we had another data center somewhere else. And those might talk to each other a little bit over a network, but there was latency. There was things that didn't necessarily work. And so to me, this is availability zone. Regions are where most people think of AWS boundaries. And a region has multiple availability zones. This is my bucket of a region with multiple AZs in it. And at minimum, each region has 3. Some of them have more. Some of them have a lot more. It all depends on what region it's in. So again, when you're looking at AWS, and this is only important because some services act differently based on how they're deployed and how they're used. And again, realizing that not everyone has data center experience. And this is why we would think of it this way. So some people might think of it like each AZ is kind of a computer. And if you have one computer here and one computer there, and you want to talk, make them talk together, you have to put a network between them. And then in your room, in your office, you might have 5 computers and they all talk together. That's like for AWS, that's a region. Regions have multiple AZs, and some services are regional. Some services are AZ bound. And then there's some services, there are a few, which I am identity access management. This is like global. These are global resources that apply to all regions, all AZs everywhere. And there aren't as many of these, but there are some like DNS. Route 53 is one that is globally available because it's public on the internet. IAM is permissions that are in your accounts, and those are global. So it doesn't matter if I'm in this AZ or this AZ or this region and that region. IAM applies everywhere. And so there are some things that are global, which again, it's hard to kind of wrap your head around those sorts of concepts when you don't understand that some things are confined to certain boundaries. Because when you log into the AWS console, the boundaries look like there's no boundary definition. It's just a web browser. And so those things are kind of hard to understand. But thanks for the question. Let me pull up console here and share again. Just a sec. All right. And I think that if you could share the screen again. Perfect. Oh, there it goes. You can share it again. Yes. So this is the AWS console. It's a web interface to all of those services that I showed in that slide deck. And this is how you can access all of them. This is the main way that I usually recommend people try to learn about the services. Whenever I learn something new, whether it's an AWS service or anything, I try to use the GUI first, because the GUI, for me, again, being a visual learner, is probably the most representative of something I already understand. If it's a server, if it's a computer, there's probably visual cues that I may not get by trying to do it, by jump in and say, like, I need to automate this. I need to make this, I need to use the API or an SDK or something. And some people learn that way, and that's fine. I don't learn that way. I always use the console first. And I try to do something one time in a GUI before I go to something else and try to make it use the API or something else. But I'll show both. So when you log into the console, and AWS accounts are free. The account, you can sign up. You can have as many of them as you want. They associate with an email address. And in an account, an AWS account is kind of like a border around all of those resources you're making. So we have some white papers if you want to read them. They're kind of in depth. They're meant for big companies on how they manage multiple accounts. How do I separate and divide up hundreds of accounts, because they get really, really large, these companies, and they need a lot of different separation for their resources. As an individual, I have one personal account, and that's fine for me because all my personal projects I can understand and I fit them in one. But if you're at a company, you definitely want to think about this border around accounts and how it, those global services, those things like IAM, if you need separation in those things, you have to separate those at an account level because you can't separate them at a region level. So this login just gives me some basics of things, services I've recently viewed in this account, and that's fine. I've pinned some services up here. We can go through and find there's a breakdown of like categories for different services, and depending on what you want to do, what you're learning, what you're trying to do, there's lots and lots of things. Again, don't focus on all of them. Don't try to do everything with all of them. But I'll show you an EC2 instance. We're just going to go and create a VM that exists in the cloud that is just like the computer, the many computers that are in my office right now. The desktop I'm using is a computer that's running, and I want one that looks like that somewhere else. And this is usually where a lot of people start with AWS, because a lot of people understand computer, your laptop, even your phone to some degree. Like there's a lot of things that look like this, and that's where people start because they're like, I understand what this is like, and I don't need to worry right now about VPCs or subnets or networking or anything like that. I can use the defaults to play around with it. So I'm going to go into the running instances, and I'm going to say I want to launch an instance. And this is very basic. You'll get this tutorial lots of places. And I'm just going to give it a name. Go with pretty much all of the defaults. You can see here, there's lots of options, and this is where you can spend a lot of time understanding how to tweak and use these things based on what you're trying to use. If your company uses Macs for automation, Windows, whatever server you want, whatever OS you want, there's plenty out there. You can build your own. Same with sizes of different, how big the instances are, and AMI versions. Here's the sizes. I do have a blog post on my blog, justingarrison.com, about instance sizes and types, because that was something that always confused me. Trying to learn AWS EC2 instance names never made sense to me. T2 micro, what does that mean? And so I have a blog post that if you were interested in EC2 specifically, there are hundreds of instance types. We're going to go with the default again, a T2 micro. It's part of the free tier. I get some amount of free capacity to run these things every month, and I don't need to worry about it. A key pair is how you can access a machine remotely through SSH, a secure shell. I'm not going to use a key pair. I don't need to log into it via SSH, and I'll show you why in a minute. But it's a traditional way that data centers and servers have always been managed with SSH, especially remote servers. But in the cloud, we have some different options. All these options about network and auto assign IP, I'm going to turn off SSH access because, again, I don't even have a key pair, so it doesn't matter. I'm not even going to allow HTTP or HTTPS traffic. None of that's there. I'm going to get 8 gig hard drive. Sure, that sounds about right. I am going to go on the advanced and select an instance profile for a SSM managed instance, which is permissions that my computer has. And those permissions allow it to use a tool called SSM. And that's how we're going to log into it. Because Session Manager is a way to log into computers in AWS without needing SSH keys. And I'm a big fan. Even when I was a customer, I've been a big fan of it for a while. If I can get rid of SSH keys, I'm even more happy. Everything else, we're going to just leave as the default. And we're going to go ahead and start. Oh, and where's the placement group? No, I don't have any of these things set up in this account, so it's fine. We're going to go ahead and launch it. And again, like I said earlier, like when I was doing this in a data center, this was months of work. Like I had to go look at the list of servers available from Dell and HP and Supermicro, and I did figure out which features I needed. And those instance types in AWS give me a lot of that. But now I got a computer. Like I didn't have to go talk to anyone else. And part of the benefits of an on-demand cloud environment is the fact that you can create this stuff on your own, and you don't have to sync with someone else about those things, and which has good sides and downsides depending on the company, right? If there are strict, especially if you're doing this on your own, be mindful of those free tiers and how much this might cost you. There are ways and plenty of blog posts out there to set up alerts for if this is costing you more money than you might want, because there are situations where someone leaves something running or they consume too much of on-demand resources, and then they need to go back and say, actually, I need to pay a bill now. Like this is, instead of buying a computer up front, you're paying for it after you're using it. But that instance is already running. It's available. It just created itself. Like I didn't have to do anything to put that out there. And this is running in Oregon, I think, US West 2. So this is about 1,000 miles north of me right now in Los Angeles. So, but it's available. It's out there and it's running, and it's started up. I think everything's fine. Right? It's not running any of my software. Again, this is the infrastructure as a service layer. This is the piece where I get to put together the things that I want, the Lego building blocks of what I'm going to use. And we can do some other things on it. We could actions, like we can shut it down. We can look at logs. One of the things I want to do is get a log into it. I actually want to go try to like do something on it. And when I worked at Disney before, we wrote this tool called SSM, which is a helper. Pull it up and I can put it in chat if needed. But it's just like a nice interface for getting SSM sessions onto computers. Again, no SSH key required. I gave the computer permissions through IAM to be able to use this service. And now when I say I want to SSM into that instance, I get a shell. And it works just like SSH in many ways. It's just doing it over a different protocol to be able to get that shell. So if I look at this computer now, look at the operating system on it, I can see that it's Amazon Linux. I can see some details about it. If I do something like top, I can see, how many tasks I have running. This is just on a server that's running out there in Oregon for me. And now I have a computer that I didn't have to go do all that other stuff for. And that's actually like really powerful. if you've ever tried to do this manually. Let's close that out. And actually I want to show you one thing here too, where the console is the best way to get started and to learn about some of these things. And the AWS command line, the CLI, is the next best way, because this mirrors a lot of the stuff you can do in the console in a way that you can do through scripts, and you can programmatically do things. And because it has an API, the cloud does, AWS does, you can use that to create and delete instances on demand, or as things are happening, or react to different things. And again, we're using EC2 because it's kind of one of those basics. But if I look at my help, it gives me all different commands I can do. I'm already set up for that accounts and region. So I could do something like AWS EC2. EC2 is the service we were using. Describe instances. And most of the AWS commands are broken up this way, where it starts with AWS. What service you're using is the next command, and then some verb about what you're trying to do with resources as part of that service. So if I describe instances, I'll get information back. I'll get this data back. Let's make it a little bit more friendly. A little bit more viewable. JSON's sometimes hard to read, but I could see I have these instances. This is my instance, and this is, all that information I just got out of JSON. All of this stuff is, I lost my console tab somewhere. Here it is. All of that stuff is part of, this information that I can scroll through, and there's plenty of tabs and places I can look at this information, but I can get it from the command line, and then I can do stuff with that. And so again, one of those benefits is, like, if I look at this instance ID, so let's say JQ, this is just a way to like filter out some of that data. So let's see if this worked. Nope, I did it wrong. I don't think JQ takes a star. Sometimes I forget the syntax. I'm gonna get it though. We're gonna. Okay. Was it reservations? Okay. Nope. I do need that. It is not called instances. It's something else, isn't it? Instances. Oh, I didn't capitalize it, did I? That's what it is. So sometimes, we all go through and learn these things. Now I should get it. There we go. Okay. And the thing I want here is my instance ID. So this is a way, again, like if I have resources, and as things grow, as you use AWS, as you do more, you start to realize that going through the console is a great first step, but you're going to want something else at some point, and you're going to want some way to do it faster. And that is one of the huge benefits of using something like AWS. So if I do that, now I'm getting that instance ID. And again, just like before, I can now use that command as, where do I want to start an instance? Where do I want to get a shell? And just like passing that argument before, using the terminal and using things levels up how powerful this stuff really becomes for you, because it is powerful and it saves a lot of time to get resources in a cloud provider and be able to do these things. But the real benefit comes from being able to figure out how to use those APIs in different ways. Sorry if I'm going too fast. Please leave me comments on what services and things you're trying to learn as well. But this instance, this EC2 instance, is based on an AZ. So this is in a data center that is running inside the Oregon region. And so I can't move this instance to another AZ. This is bound to this area. Some of the other features or services that don't have those limitations are something like Lambda. And Lambda is a regional service, and I can deploy a function that works anywhere in the region and not specific AZs. Here's a blueprint. I'm going to do a hello worlds. And get basic permissions for it. It already has some code that I can understand how that might work. I'm going to create that function. And functions allow me to run this little bit of code, these 10 lines of code, whenever I request them. And I can't log into it as like a shell like I could for an EC2 instance. It's not a server. This is a bit of code that runs whenever I need it. Go down here and we can test it. It executed. And this gives me some information about it executing. When it ran that command, it sent this out to the region, to the Oregon region, and just gave me this. It ran that code for me. Those 10 lines of code, it just ran it and gave me back the information. And then what I could do with that. And this is shrinking some of the ownership you have around what you need to do with infrastructure. Again, Lambda is a very flexible service that can run a lot of code a lot of different ways. But you don't have to worry about the servers. You don't even really need to worry about the data center, the AZs, on how they fit together. This is all something that is one abstraction layer above where you might be used to if you're plugging in computers manually. And because this runs on demand, this Lambda function isn't running anymore. I'm not testing it right now. It's not being evoked. And so I don't have to pay money for it to not run. I pay some money for like the storage that those 10 lines of code take up, but it's so minimal compared to an EC2 instance that is running. And there's a generous free tier for Lambda. Two great places to start. And it depends on what you're trying to do. And that's where I usually start with these two services for any introduction to AWS, because they're slightly different ways of thinking about things. And it depends on what you're used to. If you're used to writing code and making code execute, and you don't really care about the server bits and the infrastructure bits, great. We have lots of services that'll do that for you. But if you care about that infrastructure pieces, or you need some flexibility around things like hardware acceleration or very specific needs for hard drives, that sort of stuff, like speeds, you can have those in those infrastructure pieces too. There are, again, a lot of services at different levels of this. I'm trying to think of one of the ones, Honeycode. Honeycode is a service that can build applications from a spreadsheet, basically. It gives you a basic interface into making mobile and web apps without any of that infrastructure. You don't even need to really worry about the functions. You're just looking at the data of how the data is coming in and how you're interacting with that. And you can present it as a mobile app, and it can be used as, you can deploy it as a mobile app or a web app. And those are both super flexible ways. But again, this is that like next tier for sure, like a platform area of, I have data, I have some things I need to do, and I want to make a good interface to allow people to do that. Saw a question here. What is the AWS management console and how do I use it to interact with AWS services? This interface is the console when you go into it. So when you're in here looking at any of these services, this is where I usually recommend people start. Again, you can do things with the command line, but that's slightly more advanced. That's a piece of like, oh, I understand how the console works. I understand how the service works. What's the next step for you? What's the next thing that gives you a little more power is going to programmatically doing it, but always start with the console. It'll allow you to do a lot of things and learn a lot of things, but like I said before, don't try to learn all of them. Focus on the areas that are familiar to you or the services that kind of resonate with what you're already used to. If you have a networking background, if you like networks and you understand them, VPCs are great. That's how like the boundary of what you're doing is in a VPC, a virtual private cloud. But it has all the things that a network engineer might be used to when they're building data centers. Again, this is very much like, how do I build data centers? In a data center, you need NAT gateways and subnets and route tables, and those things are abstracted here inside of AWS and make them available to build data centers. But if you look back at my Lambda function, I didn't need to do any of that. That was the instance, but I didn't need to worry about what my VPC was. It just ran. I didn't have to do those things. And you don't have to go every layer in the stack, because some people do look at Amazon and they say, hey, I need to start at building a VPC. It's like, well, depending on what services you want to use and what you're trying to accomplish, you probably don't need to. There are different layers that you can start at and accelerate what you're doing. I will look real briefly at IAM, because this is something that's key to all of the services and something that is different depending on if you're running a data center or you're used to running servers, because IAM is a very unique piece that a cloud provider has, that AWS has, to allow you to attach identity to services and to users and to different components in your infrastructure, and then how those things can interact. Where most data centers, they do some segmentation around SSH keys or passwords that are or aren't shared with people. And there's going to be some separation between maybe how the network talks to each other. Like that network over there can't talk to this one, and that's your separation boundary. And AWS has some of that too, but the fundamentals of even if two networks can talk to each other, if they don't have IAM permissions, they won't talk to each other. And IAM wraps everything to have an identity or identity aspects of identity, different features that allow it to or don't allow it to use certain things. I'm going to go look at, I made that EC2 instance, look at the roles. SSM managed instance is the one that I used. And this has these two features as part of it. They're both AWS managed. They come from AWS. I have to create these. I made this role and called it this, but I did not have to create these types. And if I look at them, I get this huge JSON like piece that, again, don't worry about the syntax. Don't think like this is too much, because it's something to learn that is not familiar in anything else, and you will have to like understand enough of this to be able to piece it together or use AWS managed versions of it, which is what I'm using here. But this effectively says allow any of these commands. SSM is my service, and these are all verbs, just like the AWS CLI, to any resource, a star resource. So anything that is using this can do these verbs and against the SSM service on any resource. And we're also going to allow some other things explicitly here to these other things, SSM messages and EC2 messages. And this was SSM. And so this is a way that we can say, hey, anything that has this role attached to it, this permission, can do these things. And that's great because we can, again, separate out layers of permissions. As a global thing, you have to get really fine-grained in what can talk to what globally. For someone, I saw a question here about someone wants to focus on CI/CD. What is the part of AWS that speaks to that? There's two, I guess a follow-up question for you there is CI/CD. Are you talking about CI/CD for infrastructure or are you CI/CD for applications? Because both are valid aspects of CI/CD. You're integrating and you're deploying something, and you're doing it as code. You're doing it with code in some sort of pipeline. Find my mouse again. You're doing code deploy is the service that we have that does that for applications. Yeah. So you're going to look at things that are under this kind of code suite. There's code commit, code artifact, code build, code deploy. This is a great place to start for CI/CD in AWS because it has the things that you typically need for code to be able to go from a repository over to deployed somewhere, right? You might need to build it. So you might need to run some tests on it. There's a lot of things that happen in that pipeline as someone that writes code then goes and ships it to production. Code deploy is definitely the first place to start, where how you deploy that, again, it's going to depend on what you're writing, how you're deploying it. If you're going to a Lambda function or an EC2 instance or a container or some other way, there's lots of things that get written and lots of things that they deploy to. But code deploy is definitely somewhere where I would start. And that has a lot of those features that you don't need all of them up front, just like every AWS service. Not every feature of every service is something that you're like, I have to use this. It's here. Figure out what it is that you're trying to do and which pieces of it. So if you're trying to, again, build your code, link that to your Git repo, wherever that is, and then, put it up, set it up in here, right? All of these every service has a getting started guide for it. So hopefully those things will help you along the way of how to create these projects and how to actually deploy them and use them. And if you're familiar with some CI/CD other places, if you're using something like Jenkins or GitLab or GitHub, the functions that you're doing are probably going to look similar, or they're probably going to act very similar. But some of the syntax and terminology might change a little bit as you use them. But thank you for the question. The last one I was going to just mention here was S3, because this is one of the earliest features of AWS, and buckets kind of changed what it meant to store things in the world, like storing data. Traditionally, there was hard drives, which allowed you to, store stuff on a hard drive. And there was like network shares that were like, oh, I could store something over on a bigger computer with hard drives in it. And how those presented to the computer was very different, where one was, I can put files on the disk, or I have to like format and like create a file system. Like those are different things. And S3 in 2006, when it launched, changed both of those things. And it's like over an HTTP or over a web request, you can store an object. It's not a file, it's an object. And that's really hard to grasp, again, because some people treat it like a file system, some people treat it like a remote NFS or something. But that's something that you should be aware of, where S3 is one of those fundamental things. You're probably going to store something at some point. Databases are a great option for that. But if you don't need a database, if you just are trying to store some sort of asset, look at S3, because that is a great place to get started for, again, just throwing information that is highly scalable and highly available. And it's a very core piece of AWS if you're trying to learn things. So again, depending on what you're trying to do, EC2, Lambda, S3, like learn one of those half well, learn how they plug together, learn how you could use them different ways. Like you can write a Lambda function that writes to S3 or reads from S3. You can have an EC2 instance that mounts and reads information from S3. If you can do those things, like you're on your way to a very like well integrated option to be able to say like, oh, you're already gonna have to touch some networking. You're probably gonna have to touch some, you'll have to touch some IAM permissions. You're gonna have to touch a lot of things on the edges to just do those tasks of reading and writing from S3 from some compute. And that'll give you a head start on understanding how some of the other pieces might fit together. And so those were the three that I really wanted to touch on, was just these buckets are just like ways to store things and make them available either within your own network in your own VPC. They're not available publicly. They don't have to be, or even publishing a website, right? Like you can run public facing websites directly from an S3 bucket, and you can just put your HTML directly in an S3 bucket and then point Route 53 DNS to it and say like, hey, just serve this as a web page. And then that works. And you don't have to have a web server, and you don't have to have all this other like networking and load balancers and things that people might think that, oh, this is really complicated, I have to do all this stuff. And just starting as simply as possible is where I always recommend people get started. So that's all I actually had to cover. Those are the three services I wanted to show you. I just wanted to make sure you're aware of those to get started. In all of those, all of this giant picture, like if you can start with those three, which are some, again, S3 in EC2 are two of the earliest services. Lambda was down here in 2015. So it wasn't that far off. But being able to learn those things as you're learning AWS is a great start for any sort of foundational knowledge of how some of the other pieces might fit together or what other services you might want to use. So if people have any questions, happy to answer them. I'm available pretty publicly online. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on various social media places. I think my website, Justin Garrison, has an email if you if you wanted to reach out with questions. Happy to take some now or just follow up later. So thank you so much.
Comment.
Oh, I'm gonna call you dropped.
I am trying. Yeah, I was. Thank you so much for this session. Thank you. I think we've learned a lot. We also have, I think, for guys, Justin's LinkedIn handle is in the chat, so you can go ahead and follow him on LinkedIn. And just like he said, if you want to ask him questions, you can reach out to him and he would answer you. So thank you so much, Justin, for coming on this call. We sure learned a lot from this, and obviously everyone will have to go back and watch the video over and over again so they can get more details out of it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
All right. Okay. So bye, Justin. Have a lovely day
All right.
ahead.